if you have political will and leadership, global comprehensive strategies and approaches are possible. So where does that leave us today? In addition to the ongoing support that we're already providing, 2016 will provide us a unique opportunity to engage in responding in ways that hopefully will lead to very measurable and seismic changes in responses thus far. There's a series of already planned events at which the United States will participate at the highest possible level to begin moving toward a more comprehensive global solution to the current crisis. One of the first events at which we will participate is in February. The UK will be hosting a Syria pledging conference. And at that conference, we will begin to sort of sow the seeds for this broader comprehensive plan that will include additional financing, resettlement, and other tools that will be essential to responding. That will also be an opportunity for us to engage in diplomatic outreach to encourage new governments to step up to the plate to begin to fund the appeals, as well as to ask those who currently are to contribute additional resources. The UN Secretary General has announced that he will host a high-level event focused on resettlement and solutions that will be organized and hosted in Geneva in cooperation with UNHCR. Again, that will be an extremely important moment for us to look at in a very global way at the question about resettlement of Syrian refugees in particular, but others as well. In May, we will join the UN Secretary General for the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. This has been in the works now for over 2 years, and the United States is deeply engaged in this effort. It's going to be an extraordinary opportunity for us to engage with world leaders, civil society, the private sector, and others to make significant strides in advancing our humanitarian agenda very broadly. So the US goals for this summit for us include securing additional sources of financing, leveraging development assistance in ways to help countries, encourage countries to secure more access to jobs and education for Syrians and others, increasing protection, especially for women and girls, updating and modernizing the UN-led system that is responding to these crises, and building new partnerships with civil society and the private sector. The summit, we are hoping, will set the stage for a series of reforms and initiatives that we will undertake in the several years following the event. And finally, the Secretary General has announced a high-level meeting on the global refugee and migration crisis next year during the General Assembly. This, too, again, will be a critical moment for us, an opportunity for us to galvanize global support and respond in a way that we would hope would lead to more sort of comprehensive responsibility sharing and sort of measurable outcomes. So 2016 is definitely a year where you're going to see tremendous US leadership around the refugee question in particular, humanitarian issues in general. As the President has said, the Syrian refugee crisis and the spillover challenges in Europe have evoked global interest that demands a global response. And I think that you will really hopefully see some major steps forward on this agenda in 2016.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to our hosts, and thank you especially to all of you who are here this afternoon late on a Friday afternoon at the end of December. Today's conflicts are just not numerous. They're often brutal, chronic, and intractable. Long-term unceasing violence or oppression means that uprooted people aren't able to go home. These are not short-term emergencies. A child born in a refugee camp at the start of a crisis will often spend his or her entire childhood away from home. In some situations, camp midwives deliver the grandchildren of the original refugees. Refugees make up just one segment of the population that's on the move. But most of the 60 million people displaced globally are not refugees, but, as Elizabeth pointed out, internally displaced persons who have not crossed international borders. For instance, when ISIL or Daesh seized roughly a third of Iraq, more than 3 million people fled. not to neighboring countries, but to other parts of Iraq, especially the Kurdish areas of the northeast of the country. And obviously, sometimes, most times, many times, governments are the problem. Syria is a home to about 7 million IDPs, or 1/5 of the world's total. The Assad regime drops barrel bombs on its own people, destroying hospitals and schools and killing rebels and civilians alike. Like IDPs and refugees, migrants traveling without documents can be exceptionally vulnerable. Economic migrants suffer alongside refugees. Both are subject to the same threats. They can be abused, raped, kidnapped, abandoned, or crammed into the same trucks, cages, and leaky rubber boats. So what is the United States doing about this problem? The United States leads in contributing to humanitarian operations around the world, and my bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, has provided more than $3 billion in fiscal year 2015 alone, $3 billion. We do this chiefly by working with the UN and other international organizations in this field. We fund the UN Refugee Agency, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others. The U.S. Agency for International Development funds the World Food Program and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We also channel relief dollars through other UN agencies you've heard of, like UNICEF, and through the best non-governmental organizations and charities that work in this field. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance, food, shelter, medical care, and clean water and sanitation. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. In addition, we manage a refugee resettlement program, which identifies some of the world's most vulnerable refugees, brings them here to the United States, and offers them a fresh start. Most refugees get jobs, enroll their children in school, pay taxes, revitalize communities, and after 5 years may choose to take the test to become naturalized American citizens. Next year, we will accept at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Some critics say that this number is too low. Others oppose admitting Syrians, arguing that terrorists may seek to enter the United States as refugees. The U.S. government is taking every possible precaution to make sure that doesn't happen. Specially trained Department of Homeland Security officials screen applicants, conducting extensive security checks and lengthy in-person interviews. We are determined to do more to help the world's refugees, which is why we will increase the number we will resettle here annually for all global refugees from 7,000, the ceiling for the past 3 years, to 85,000 in fiscal year 2016 and 100,000 in fiscal year 2017. U.S. diplomacy and humanitarian aid are vital. In crisis after crisis, we have been able to spearhead the international response and use our influence to help keep borders open and aid flowing. This has saved millions of lives. But today, aid groups are stretched thin. All of the UN humanitarian organizations are grappling with severely insufficient funds to address a long list of crises. The United Nations is seeking $19.5 billion for humanitarian assistance for this calendar year, 2015. And so far, and remember what date it is today, so far it's received only half of what it was looking for. How can we close the gap and meet such vast needs? Private giving could help. Private donors may be reticent because man-made crisis can be messy and complex. Image after image of bombings, barbed wire, and misery can be overwhelming, even numbing. But 7 million children have been affected by the Syrian crisis, and many have been traumatized. A whole generation urgently needs help and care. And this is why my colleagues and I support the No Lost Generation campaign launched by UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. We must adapt to changing needs and new technology to make humanitarian aid more efficient. The majority of the refugees today actually live in cities and towns, not camps. Instead of handouts, they may need to be handed a work permit. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, vulnerable groups such as women and children, the elderly, and the disabled need aid tailored for them. Development agencies should build more classrooms, hospital wards, and water systems so that the society hosting refugees do not suffer for doing the right thing. The World Humanitarian Summit that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is scheduled for spring 2016 offers an opportunity to call attention to what does and doesn't work in humanitarian response and recruit more governments and more organizations to invest in best practices. We can help governments respond humanely when migrants and refugees arrive at their borders. We can crack down on human smuggling. We can explore legal alternatives to dangerous, irregular migration. Legal migration can fill gaps in the labor pool and provide financial lifelines to families and communities back home. Finally, and most importantly, we must stay vigilant and engaged and take whatever action we can to stop ethnic, religious, and political rivalries from exploding into violence. We must do what we can to prevent life from being so bleak that risking death seems preferable. This means strengthening programs run by the State Department and USAID that foster the rule of law, fight corruption, and create economic opportunity overseas. Whatever we do, however incremental, matters. Thank you.
Thank you. But let me ask the first question, which is, to the extent that you might be able to comment on this, which is, with the House overwhelmingly passing this pause on refugees coming into the United States, and also part of the bill that was passed was that the FBI director and the DHS director and other people have to certify personally that people are not terrorists. What is the practical effect of that, do you think, in terms of bringing refugees into the country, or is it too early to tell?
Well, it doesn't have any legs in the Senate, and I
Yeah.
don't think it will go anywhere. We're waiting to see what's in the omnibus, and that's very unclear to me so far. But if that kind of legislation were to pass, it would close down our program. I could go through the reasons of why it was, but I think it's more important to note that it's a political decision, a political vote, and it is designed to close the program down.
Right, because this certification, as a practical matter, would be immensely
All
onerous.
aspects of it are impractical and impossible to carry out, and it was designed that way to close down the program.
And as a follow-up, the Senate has passed...
by the way, can I add that,
Yeah.
that half of the Democrats, I think more than half of the members of Congress who are Democratic that voted for that have signed a letter saying that they would not support it at this point. Yeah.
And related question, the visa waiver program, there is in the Senate, this is a much more sensible measure, which is essentially if you visited Iraq or Syria or in the last 5 years, that you wouldn't automatically go through the visa waiver program if you're a country that enjoys that. That's the correct characterization of that?
Yes, yeah.
And so that seems like a fairly sensible measure.
Not my area, but
Yeah.
it's something the administration supports.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, if you have a question, Tara McKelvey from the BBC.
Hi, thanks. I have a question for you about Donald Trump. I'm wondering how his remarks have affected your work.
I think it's going to be very hard for these guys to answer.
No, I'll answer.
Okay, all right.
I mean, it makes it, I think, first of all, just the remarks by themselves make it more difficult for us to work on our programs integrating refugees into the U.S. because it makes them more hesitant to be open and feel welcome within communities. But I think second of all that the large number of people that spoke out against it afterwards is reassuring.
Great. Another question? If you raise your hand. You have a question, sir?
Thank you very much. I'm Ali Dodd Mafinez. How do you, as representatives of the U.S. government, see what Germany has done? Because their ambassador is going to be speaking a year later, accepting close to 1 million refugees, a country that isn't traditionally seen as an immigrant receiving country versus the U.S. Thank you.
I think it's important to draw a distinction between what's going on in Europe and in here. It's always very different when you have a large, huge number of people approaching your border and walking across it, and there they are, and you have to work with them there. And the situation that we face in the